Marie and Tail. Step over to Kira.
Special report is up next, Emily. Hey, Brett.
I wanted to hear more about the Golden Girls cruise. Thanks, Greg. This is a Fox News Alert. Good evening, I'm Bret Baier. We have major news on 3 legal cases tonight, plus analysis. In Chicago, actor Jussie Smollett is charged with making a false police report, and authorities are now calling a hoax alleging a hate crime. He made bail today. Here in Washington, a judge comes down hard on longtime Trump ally Roger Stone over a pointed social media post against the judge in that case. Stone remains out on bail. And in the suburb of D.C. of Greenbelt, Maryland, a Coast Guard officer accused of domestic terrorism gets no bail at all. We have Fox team coverage tonight. Judge Andrew Napolitano in New York looks at the legal ramifications of all these high-profile cases. Jillian Turner in Maryland with the scary story of a Coast Guard officer and his hit list of targets. Catherine Herridge in Washington with a very unhappy judge and a stern warning to a Trump ally. But we begin with senior correspondent Mike Tobin in Chicago with the latest on an actor and a real-life story that sounds like something you might see in the movies. Good evening, Mike.
Good evening, Brett. Actor Jussie Smollett is now out on bond. An assistant state's attorney laid out in very precise detail how he directed a couple of associates to stage the attack, to shout racist and homophobic things at him, and to beat him up. But not too bad.
Jussie, any comment?
$10,000 is what the star-turned-suspect Jussie Smollett posted to walk free from the Cook County Jail.
You guys want to speak on Smollett's behalf?
His supportive siblings were silent, filing out of the courthouse. Judge John Light called the Empire star outrageous for conjuring up evil from the nation's history. And an assistant state's attorney laid out in intricate detail how Smollett planned a bogus hate crime, enlisting the help of Abel and Ola Asundero, getting them in his car January 25th.
Once inside, Smollett asked Ola if he could trust him. When Ola said he could, Smollett detailed his plans of the attack to the brothers.
An angry superintendent of police in Chicago said the motive was dissatisfaction with his salary. So Smollett conjured up a scheme for a hate crime complete with homophobic slurs, hateful politics, and painful symbols of racism.
Why would anyone, especially an African-American man, use the symbolism of a noose to make false accusations? How could someone look at the hatred and suffering associated with that symbol and see an opportunity to manipulate that symbol to further his own public profile?
In light of the charges, 20th Century Fox, which produces Empire and is owned by the same parent company as Fox News, said we are evaluating the situation and we are considering our options. President Trump weighed in on Twitter. What about MAGA and the tens of millions you insulted with your racist and dangerous comments? The FBI got involved when a threatening letter covered in crushed Tylenol for white powder was delivered to the Empire studios. Now it's clear it was sent by Smollett.
Smollett attempted to gain attention by sending a false letter that relied on racial, homophobic, and political language.
With the words that said, Smollett, Jussie, you will die, black. There was no address, but the return address said in big red, like caps, MAGA. Did I make that up too?
And it came out today that Smollett paid the Asundero brothers with a personal check. His status on the show Empire appears to be unchanged. It was announced in court today that he was scheduled to shoot this afternoon. And in fact, when his SUV left the courthouse here, it went to the Cinespay studios where Empire is shot. Brett?
Mike Tobin in Chicago. Mike, thanks. One of President Trump's longtime confidants had to do some explaining this afternoon in court. Roger Stone in federal court after one specific social media post involving the judge in his case. That judge was not impressed or moved by Stone's explanation or apology. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge was in the court earlier today, joins us now with details. Good evening, Catherine.
Thank you, Brennan. Good evening. The federal judge Amy Berman Jackson further restricted the gag order. It means political operative Roger Stone cannot talk about the case to reporters, post on social media, or use surrogates. Stone took the stand and apologized for posting a photo on Instagram of Judge Jackson with what appeared to be a target in the background. Stone took down the post almost immediately and fully apologized for his, quote, stupid lapse in judgment. Taking questions from the judge today, his lawyer and the prosecution, Stone took full responsibility, but explained he was under extreme emotional and financial stress. His consulting business and savings have dried up, he said. The judge said Stone's apology rang hollow, and if there were more issues in the future, the judge threatened to revoke Stone's bail and possibly send him to jail, Brett.
Catherine, there's a lot of buzz here in D.C. that the special counsel, Robert Mueller's report is nearly done, maybe handed over to the Justice Department. Where does that stand tonight?
Well, Brett, sources familiar with the special counsel probe tell Fox News it is, quote, near the end, though the president's legal team has not received formal notification that special counsel Robert Mueller's report is complete. Those close to the case say several data points have now aligned. The new Attorney General William Barr is in place and now assembling a new team. During his confirmation hearings, Barr made clear the completed Mueller report would not be released. It was up to the new Attorney General, he said, to summarize the findings for the public and for Congress.
Under the current regulations, the special counsel report is confidential. And the report that goes public would be a report by the Attorney General.
The question now is how far Congress will go to obtain the entire Mueller report, especially if the findings were not enough to warrant criminal prosecution, Brett.
We shall see. Catherine, thank you. We'll follow all of that. An Internal Revenue Service investigator in California is admitting he leaked confidential financial transactions made by former Trump attorney Michael Cohen to the lawyer for adult film star Stormy Daniels, Michael Avenatti. John C. Fry has been charged with searching for and disseminating suspicious activity reports. Those are reports filed by financial investigators when they note potentially suspicious transactions. Michael Cohen himself was spotted leaving Capitol Hill today ahead of testimony he will give to several committees next week. A Coast Guard officer who federal prosecutors call a domestic terrorist wanted to kill almost everyone on Earth, according to court filings. Prosecutors are saying Lieutenant Christopher Hassan was assembling an arsenal to do just that. Correspondent Jillian Turner has details on today's session in court from Greenbelt, Maryland.
Thankfully, we were able to avoid and prevent any loss of life in this case.
U.S. District Attorney Robert Hur breathing a sigh of relief this afternoon after Coast Guard officer Christopher Hassan's hearing wrapped up. Judge Charles Day presided over the courtroom. He found Hassan presents a danger to the public and will hold him in detention while prosecutors continue to gather evidence. Day says the onus is now on the prosecution to prove Hassan's intention was, as they say, to commit an act of domestic terrorism. Day took pains to point out today's charges wouldn't normally hold enough water to put a defendant in detention. Upon Hassan's arrest Friday, 15 firearms, 1,000 rounds of ammo, and a large supply of prescription drug tramadol were found in his apartment, just a few miles from the nation's capital and the very lawmakers Hassan was hoping to execute.
The sheer number and force of the weapons that were recovered from Mr. Hassan's residence in this case, coupled with the disturbing nature of his writings, appear to reflect a very significant threat to the safety of our community, particularly given the position of trust that Mr. Hassan held with the United States government.
Hassan's a lieutenant with the Coast Guard, but previously served in both the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army. Files found on his home computer showed he planned to target dozens of Democratic lawmakers, including 2 presidential hopefuls, as well as prominent journalists and TV personalities. His Google search history also showed he'd spent countless hours tracking down his targets. Prosecutors said in court today it's all these pieces of evidence together that make Hassan a dangerous public threat. Hassan's public defender says he denies every one of the allegations and that he's never before been charged with a crime. So now the government, the prosecution, has 14 days to gather evidence, more evidence, and report back here to the district court judge in Greenbelt. Until then, Brett, Hassan's security clearance and access to Coast Guard headquarters has been revoked.
Jillian Turner live in Greenbelt, Maryland. Jillian, thanks. Let's get some analysis from our judge, Fox News senior judicial analyst Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge, first I want to bring you to the Smollett case and take a listen to his interview with GMA and then the police superintendent today.
You do such a disservice when you lie about things like this.
Why would anyone, especially an African-American man, use the symbolism of a noose to make false accusations? How could someone look at the hatred and suffering associated with that symbol and see an opportunity to manipulate that symbol to further his own public profile?
Judge, it was quite something listening to the police superintendent, Eddie Johnson, today. He was not holding back his anger about dealing with this particular case. Your thoughts?
Well, I think the police superintendent, who was very articulate and very eloquent, was expressing the collective indignation of the government and the people of Chicago who had been abused beyond their imaginings in the past couple of weeks. The evidence that was laid out, however, by the assistant prosecutor in the hallway of the courthouse after his Smollett's hearing today is so precise, so clear, so damning, and shows such a careful planning and plotting that the government now has the opportunity to charge him with a variety of things, from scratching himself, which is altering evidence, to every time he lied to the police, another charge of lying. All of this on top of filing a false police report. You're showing now the envelope that went through the mail. This triggers federal jurisdiction. So using the post office to mail a threatening letter, one that contained a white powder in it as if it was some sort of a horrific substance, we now know it was harmless. Even if you're mailing that to yourself, triggers the federal authorities of posing a terroristic threat through the mails. Bret, facing 25 years in jail if you add up the potential state crimes and the potential federal crimes.
Pretty amazing after all we've seen in this case, the evolution. I want to turn to Roger Stone. He goes before the judge after this post on social media, on Instagram, that shows the judge and has this picture of crosshairs in the background. He apologizes, says it was not meant to be, and he apologized for it profusely in court. She's not buying it, and essentially puts a gag order on him talking about this case. Talk about this and what, potentially this means.
I thought she was going to revoke his bail because of the veiled threat to her. And this threat, this Instagram posting, full disclosure, I've known Roger Stone for years, though I've not discussed this with him. This, combined with an effort by his lawyers to remove the judge from the case, would have been enough to have revoked his bail, but she showed him some mercy. She imposed a standard garden variety gag order which prevents Roger Stone or anybody in his behalf from discussing the case publicly. Now, she can't gag his surrogates, but she can prevent him from dispatching his surrogates to come on television and present his case. But she was very clear, Bret, this is the last chance you get. If it happens again, I will change your environment, a fancy phrase for you'll be locked up, as Manafort was, before your trial even starts.
Yeah, and obviously we're waiting for the Mueller report in the meantime to come out in coming days. Quickly, this Hassan case, just a word, Judge, about how good investigators are to get in on the front side of this. They're telling a pretty scary story about this guy.
When you look at the people that he targeted and the meticulous way in which he went about his work, my reaction was, thanks be to God they stopped him when they did, because these are all people as to whom they have absolute right to say what they wish, and this guy wanted to become an avenging angel against those who disagreed with his politics. No place for that in America.
Judge Andrew Napolitano, we appreciate it as always.
Thank you, Bret.
Another Fox News alert now. There will be a new election in the North Carolina congressional district engulfed in a scandal over voting fraud. Today, the Republican leading the race dropped his effort to be the certified winner. Correspondent Steve Harrigan is in our Southeast newsroom tonight with specifics. Good evening, Steve.
Bret, good evening. This is the first time in the history of North Carolina that they're going to have to hold an entirely new congressional election due to charges of voter fraud. An operative who worked for the Republican candidate Mark Harris is accused of trying to harvest absentee ballots. He had a team of people who he was paying supposedly between $2 and $3 for each of those absentee ballots. Harris, the Republican, was leading in the unofficial count by about 905 votes. He was pushing to get certified as the winner, but he had a dramatic turnaround after testimony by his son at the hearing at the Board of Elections. His son had said he had warned his father on multiple occasions that some of the electioneering might be illegal. Harris said Due to ill health, he suffered some confusion and finally came around and agreed that a new election was needed.
Neither I nor any of the leadership of my campaign were aware of or condoned the improper activities that have been testified to in this hearing. Through the testimony I've listened to over the past 3 days, I believe a new election should be called. It's become clear to me that the public's confidence in the 9th District seat general election has been undermined to an extent that a new election is warranted.
Some of those campaign workers did more than just harvest absentee ballots. One woman said she even filled them in where the voters left certain races blank. She said she used the same color ink as the voter used. The 9th District in North Carolina has now not had a representative for the past 3 months, and it could be months more before they finally get one. This election will be run from scratch, and that means primaries. Brett?
We'll follow all of that race. Steve, thanks. The Trump administration is welcoming a delegation from China to the U.S. for new high-level trade talks. The administration is not welcoming, however, a woman who left this country to join ISIS terrorists and who now wants to come back. Correspondent Kevin Cork has the latest tonight from the White House.
Everybody acknowledges that what she did was horrible, disgusting, unacceptable.
The lawyer for the family of ISIS bride, Hoda Mathana, says she's an American and simply wants to come home to face the consequences of her actions.
She's willing to pay whatever debts she has to society. She's even willing to spend years behind bars if that's the debt she owes. And she wants to speak out to ensure that other young women are not brainwashed and manipulated into committing the same horrible mistakes that she's done.
On Twitter, Shibley posted documents that he says proves that Mathana is an American, despite charges from the administration that she's not.
This is a woman who inflicted enormous risk on American soldiers, on American citizens. She's a terrorist. She's not coming back. President Trump made clear that she wasn't coming back. She's not a U.S. citizen. She is not entitled to U.S. citizenship, and she's not coming back to our country to pose a threat.
White House officials believe Mathana is a threat because she not only left Alabama to support ISIS, she also made online posts urging ISIS followers to attack Americans on U.S. soil. In her defense, the 24-year-old says she was brainwashed, telling the Guardian newspaper that she hopes the U.S. will forgive me for being so ignorant and that she believes America gives second chances. Secretary Pompeo also weighed in on today's trade talks between the U.S. and China. Negotiators for the world's two largest economies met in Washington with a U.S.-imposed March 1st deadline quickly approaching. Negotiators are said to be drawing up numerous memorandums of understanding on structural issues, including forced technology transfer and cyber theft, intellectual property rights, services, currency, agriculture, and non-tariff barriers to trade.
It's one thing to write something on a piece of paper. It's another thing to have enforcement mechanisms. And I know our trade team is hard at work making sure that the American people get that.
Brett, the Chinese are looking for ways to reduce their massive trade imbalance with the U.S., including buying more U.S. ag products. As for that March 1st deadline, the president has suggested it's not a magical date. He could blow right past it so long as there's progress in the talks. Brett?
Kevin Cork live on the North Lawn. Kevin, thanks. Stocks were down today. The Dow lost 104. The S&P 500 fell 10. The Nasdaq was off 29. Up next, the Pope tells bishops now is the time for action in the church's clergy sex abuse crisis.
This program is brought to you by Liberty Mutual Insurance. Only pay for what you need.
As someone who
Major turmoil tonight in and around Venezuela. Disputed President Nicolas Maduro is closing the border with Brazil to try to keep out humanitarian aid. Maduro also said on state TV today he's considering a similar move on the border with Colombia. That's where opposition leader Juan Guaido headed today with some 80 lawmakers. Guaido has pledged to bring in the humanitarian aid by land and sea on Saturday. Another caravan of Central American migrants is heading toward the U.S. southern border. The group of about 1,000 people crossed into Mexico after overwhelming federal police and immigration agents during a brief clash there. And just within the last hour, we learned that Customs and Border Patrol in El Paso has installed concrete barriers and wire at the port of entry there in anticipation of a possible large group of immigrants that could try to cross the border at that spot. Pope Francis says bishops must get serious about dealing with the church's clergy sex abuse crisis. The Pope opened a 4-day summit on the issue today. Religion correspondent Lauren Green has that story tonight from Rome.
The faith community under our care should know that we mean business.
And so began the first day of the first ever summit on clergy sex abuse at the Vatican. The gathering, the Catholic Church version of the heads of state, brought together the presidents of the world's bishops' conferences to tackle what's become a plague among their ranks.
Il santo popolo di Dio ci guarda.
The holy people of God look to us and expect from us not simple and predictable condemnations, but concrete and effective measures to be undertaken.
Francis presiding over a somber and penitential meeting. The theme of the day, responsibility. After prayer, the bishops watched a video of victims' emotional testimonies detailing their abuse at the hands of a trusted priest. One victim said, quote, "You are the physicians of the soul, and yet with rare exceptions you have been transformed in some cases into murderers of the soul, into murderers of the faith." The bishops say they need to take ownership of the problem.
Our lack of response to the suffering of victims, even to the point of rejecting them and covering up the scandal to protect perpetrators and the institution, has injured our people.
Francis is trying to get to the root cause of the abuse, has called it demonic. But victims' advocates say the Pope just needs to adhere to his zero-tolerance mantra.
If an employee, in this case a priest, or a nun, or any other religious, commits a crime against a child, rapes, abuses a child, and they are convicted of that crime, they should be permanently excluded from ministry.
Pope Francis also handed bishops 21 points of reflection before they headed into smaller working groups away from the cameras. Tomorrow's session will tackle the issue of accountability. Brett?
Lauren Green in Rome. Lauren, thanks. A federal judge in Florida has ruled prosecutors, including current Labor Secretary Alex Acosta, violated federal law when they reached a plea agreement in 2007 with financier and sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The judge also says they failed to inform his dozens of victims. Nebraska Republican Senator Ben Sasse, who pushed for the investigation, calls Epstein a monster and says the fact that it took so long to get the court ruling is, quote, infuriating. Up next, what do Democrats want in 2020 besides defeating President Trump? We'll ask some of them on the trail.
Introducing the new
As we're entering the 2020 presidential campaign season, we're basically already here, we all know one thing. All Democrats want, more than anything, to defeat President Trump. But after that, things get a little murky. Tonight, correspondent Peter Doocy tells us what he's hearing from Democrats in early voting states about what they want in the eventual nominee.
Mayor, it's so great to be in your city.
Democrats trying to woo early state voters are hearing that when it comes to beating Donald Trump,
we're desperate.
But the things that consume Capitol Hill,
Roger Stone,
Mr. Manafort, Mueller report,
hello everybody,
are missing on the campaign trail because none of those names were prominent at events in early states in the last week. Potential Democratic primary goers there are much more passionate about things like health care.
What are you going to do for a small business, which both sides agree on is the backbone of America, to offer quality health care to all Americans?
I recently fractured and dislocated my shoulder, but the problem is I'm going to have to pay for it out of pocket.
Having just reached the age of 65, I thought I was going to be like not paying so much for my drugs. Oh my God.
In South Carolina, climate change is seen as a unique threat.
I think our state is very vulnerable with the rising seas, flooding.
And in New Hampshire, there was a plea for labor protections.
What you are doing now as a senator and what you will do as president to level the playing field for unions.
Nobody seemed too concerned about bankrolling ambitious progressive platforms except in Columbia, South Carolina, where one man had a question for Kamala Harris.
Said you support Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. Simultaneously, we have a $22 trillion national debt and a $1.2 trillion deficit. How do you square that circle?
But ultimately, people want presidential hopefuls to explain what they can do for them, like this educator in Manchester.
Why don't I get paid more? Because I come home with my head dragging off the floor and crying at night for these kids, and I get paid minimum wage.
So even though everything in the political universe seems to revolve around President Trump, Democratic candidates I've seen aren't hearing a ton of specific complaints about him. They're hearing more questions about what Democrats could possibly offer to improve their lives at work or at home. Brett?
Substance. Peter, thank you. Tonight we continue our week-long look at the Green New Deal, championed by self-described Democratic Socialist Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. This evening we look at what would seem to many to be the heart of the matter, climate change. Correspondent Doug McElway examines how the plan deals with one of the most controversial topics and the possible solutions tied to it in all of politics.
There is no fixing our economy without addressing the racial wealth gap.
For diehard skeptics of climate change, the rollout of the Green New Deal with its wealth redistribution and restructuring of the economy was a tip-off to an unspoken agenda.
You know, we always knew climate was a stalking horse for socialism, communism, totalitarianism, whatever you want to call it.
But even many Democrats who support a climate change agenda saw the rollout as absurd.
I've read it and I've reread it, and I asked Ed Markey, what in the heck is this?
If you just add up the promises there, it's clear it's unaffordable, and it's clear it's unrealistic.
Some hope that from the excesses of the Green New Deal, more moderate voices emerge.
The climate debate has been driven for years by the edges of each party.
Grumet points to the chair and ranking member of the Senate Energy Committee, both from poor fossil fuel states, both pushing for promising technologies like carbon capture and storage.
Till responsible people like, Senators Murkowski and Manchin and the Energy Committee start to really enforce against the edges, we will continue to yell at each other.
Others question whether there's any urgency at all, that the so-called 97% consensus of climate scientists is meaningless. Climatologist John Christie notes that the greatest scientific breakthroughs in history have broken with consensus.
I take a real hard look at climate model output and can demonstrate that these models are just too sensitive to carbon dioxide and that the real world is not spiraling off into some dangerous territory of climate.
Novelist Michael Crichton once suggested another solution. He looked back to the turn of the last century, when people, quote, didn't know what a radio was, or an airport, or a movie, or a television, or a computer, or a cell phone, or a jet, an antibiotic, a rocket, a satellite, an MRI, ICU, IUD, or what IBM was.
He went on and then ended with
Now you tell me who can predict the world of 2100. His point was that models only carry the present into the future, and that the creative genius of individuals who bettered life in the past will do the same in the future. Brett?
Doug, thanks. Tomorrow night we conclude our series on the Green New Deal with a look at its primary sponsor and her role in the Democratic Party. The rush to judgment in the Jussie Smollett case. We'll discuss it all with the panel when we come back.
Could switching to gun
This announcement today recognizes that Empire actor Jussie Smollett took advantage of the pain and anger of racism to promote his career. My concern is that hate crimes will now publicly be met with a level of skepticism that previously didn't happen.
How can you doubt that? Like, how do you not believe that? It's the truth. And then it became a thing of like, oh, it's not necessarily that you don't believe that this is the truth. You don't even want to see the truth.
To be quite honest, it's shameful.
An angry Chicago police superintendent today laying out the case that they have against Jussie Smollett, who is now charged with falsifying this alleged hate crime, planning a bogus hate crime, including mailing a letter to himself, as the assistant state attorney laid out in intricate detail. Now, when this first happened and his explanation for it, everyone seemed to weigh in, including presidential candidates. Cory Booker and Kamala Harris both called it a modern-day lynching in tweets. Just moments ago, Senator Harris released a statement about this after being asked repeatedly on the trail about it. Like most of you, I've seen the reports about Jussie Smollett, and I'm sad, frustrated, and disappointed. When anyone makes false claims to police, it not only diverts resources away from serious investigations, but it makes it more difficult for other victims of crime to come forward. At the same time, we must speak the truth. Hate crimes are on the rise in America. Part of the tragedy of this situation is that it distracts from that truth and has been seized by some who would like to dismiss and downplay the very real problems that we must address. We should not allow that. I will always condemn racism and homophobia. We must always confront hate directly, and we must always seek justice. Kamala Harris there from the trail. Let's bring in our panel. Matthew Continetti, editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon, national security analyst Morgan Ortagus, and Jonathan Swan, national political reporter for Axios. Pretty well worded, Jonathan, in that response, but a sticky issue for these candidates who obviously went down the road when this first came out.
Right. The first statement was, passionate and righteous, and she was asked about it. There was a piece of video where she was asked about it and sort of had this strange moment where she turned to her staff looking quite irritated, and then turned back and clearly thought more about it and put out this statement. There have been other politicians. I think Nancy Pelosi deleted her tweet initially where she condemned this. So there was a whole lot of people who initially condemned this who are now in various ways trying to quietly walk it back.
Morgan, the police superintendent in Chicago, I think a lot of people were riveted by Eddie Johnson. Here's another piece of it.
How can an individual who's been embraced by the city of Chicago turn around and slap everyone in this city in the face? To make things worse, the accusations within this phony attack received national attention for weeks. When you get the opportunity, the shooting victims and families in this city that are victims of those crimes, give them the same amount of attention.
Morgan.
Yeah, I thought the police chief did an excellent job there, but what he did leave out of that press conference was the political element to this, and that's why this has gotten more coverage than all of the tragic murders that the police chief spoke about. And so I did think it was a missed opportunity to talk about that. One thing that we have learned is that Jussie Smollett is a great actor. I've watched him on Empire, but he's a terrible writer. When we see what he staged, not only in this attack, but in the letter, and of course the resources that were diverted. One thing I would say, just going back to Kamala Harris, one thing to remember is there are plenty of people who voted for President Trump in 2016 that also voted for Barack Obama. So I think while it might not help her in a primary, it's important to remember those voters and to keep those voters in the back of her mind, and to remember that those people could still potentially be winnable. And whenever she addresses it fairly and shows that she's not biased to everyone that is supportive of Trump, there may be an opening there.
The president did not stay out of this. There was some said they thought he might, but he did not. At Jussie Smollett, what about MAGA and the tens of millions of people you insulted with your racist and dangerous comments? Hashtag Make America Great Again. Notably, he didn't tweet about the Coast Guard officer who was arrested by the FBI and his background of planning white nationalist killings. But your thoughts in the big picture here, Matthew, as we look at kind of where we are in this culture moment?
We're nowhere good. Like, the same people who rushed to embrace Smollett's faux story were the people who rushed to criticize the Covington Catholic boys when that snippet of viral video came out from the pro-life movement march in D.C. And what is the connective tissue, right? It's a willingness to believe the worst of Donald Trump and his supporters. And that's why people rush to back Smollett. That's why they rush to condemn the Covington Catholic boys. And now, Republicans sometimes are always eager to embrace the worst critiques of Democrats, but we see time and time again that the mainstream media amplifies the liberal critique of Republicans to a far greater extent than it does the conservative critique of Democrats. And this willingness to believe narratives, no matter their truth, is very dangerous to democracy, which depends, Bret, as we know, on evidence and patience.
You've seen the president and how he deals with Twitter, and obviously he saw this moment as a political, like, hey, this is the point. My supporters are getting blamed for everything.
To his defense, it wasn't Trump who inserted himself in this moment. It was Jussie Smollett.
Exactly.
He's the one who said that the people were walking around Chicago saying this is MAGA country, lynching people, etc. So, this was not something that Trump inserted himself in. He was explicitly inserted in the story by the hoaxer. So I will give Trump some defense there.
There you go. Next up, should the Alabama woman who joined ISIS be allowed to come back into the U.S.? Go to bed.
What should we do with it first?
As you've been hearing me say, African American unemployment is at an all-time low, historic low. In the history of our country, it's never been better, so that's a great thing. Thank you all as well to the young African American activists who are here today. You are really and truly the leaders of the future, and get in there and go down. Since the beginning of our republic, African Americans have given their heart, their love, and their very lives to the pursuit. And you know this better than anybody. You have worked so hard. I guess when you get right down to it, we're all working very hard. But the pursuit of liberty and justice for all. During the Revolutionary War, African American soldiers fought at the Battle of Yorktown and helped our nation gain independence. In the next century, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and countless others risked everything to end the evil of slavery and secure the sacred blessings of freedom. And here we are all together in the White House. This is a great thing, right? This is a great thing. And this is a very, very special place. A century later, Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and the immortal Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. challenged our nation to fulfill its founding promise that we are all created equal by God. In every moment of our history, African Americans have called our nation to greatness. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the birth of Jackie Robinson. How good was Jackie Robinson? How good was Jackie? As a baseball fan, Jackie was special. He had to be special because that was not an easy journey for Jackie. He was a special man. His courage on the field and off the field stands as an everlasting monument to the triumph of the human spirit. African American scientists, artists, musicians, educators, faith leaders, and countless others have lifted our nation to absolutely incredible heights. Today, we thank God for all of the blessings the African American community continues to give our nation, and we pledge our resolve to expand opportunity for Americans of every race, religion, color, and creed. Since my election, we have created 5.3 million new jobs. People thought that was... And I tell you, I'm very proud of it being the lowest ever in the history for African Americans. But today, right now, we have the most people working in the history of our nation, almost 160 million people. We've never had that many people working. Tell me, how did they beat us on the debate stand when we say we have the best unemployment numbers ever, right? The best unemployment numbers ever and the most people working ever. The best economy, perhaps, that we've ever had. We've got a lot of things going on here, very good things. And we cut your taxes, by the way, and we cut your taxes. You're right. He said, don't ever get tired, Mr. President. I better not get tired. Under my administration, the African American poverty rate has fallen to its lowest level, and if you think about that, that's a special category. The poverty rate for African Americans is the best it's ever been, the lowest level it's ever achieved. Nearly 1 million additional African Americans have found new jobs. As a really, and I think this we can really attribute it to regulatory cuts, or as a result of our tax cuts, the largest tax cuts in the history.
Dead bodies in public. We would see kids seeing dead bodies in public. We would see limbs splattered on the floor. And seeing it with your own eyes really made you wake up and change.
She's a terrorist. She's not coming back. She's not a U.S. citizen. She is not entitled to U.S. citizenship. And she's not coming back to our country to pose a threat.
She's willing to pay whatever debts she has to society. She's even willing to spend years behind bars if that's the debt she owes. And she wants to speak out to ensure that other young women are not brainwashed and manipulated into committing the same horrible mistakes that she's done.
If she did believe in the citizenship oath, she abandoned it and actually violated it and became an enemy combatant.
There are actually two cases, one here in the U.S. with this woman from Alabama, Hoda Muthana, and the other woman from the UK, and the UK is saying you can't come back either, Shamima Begum, both of them tied to ISIS, leaving their homeland to go to ISIS, to be with ISIS fighters, and to post online urging ISIS to attack Americans and Europeans. The president tweeting, the United States is asking Britain, France, Germany, and other European allies to take back over 800 ISIS fighters that we captured in Syria and put them on trial. The caliphate is ready to fall. The alternative is not a good one, and that we will be forced to release them. Yesterday, tweeting, I have instructed Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and he fully agrees, not to allow Hoda Muthana back into the country, specifically on this case. Morgan, thoughts?
I think it speaks volumes that she'd rather rot in an American jail than eat grass in these ISIS camps. So that is a masterful defeat of the caliphate, at least from a PR perspective. We've got a couple of issues going on here. We've got the factual and legal basis of was she ever an American citizen or not? Was she born on the diplomatic blue list when her father was at the UN? So that's one issue that clearly the State Department will have to deal with from a legal perspective. The other issue is, of course, is what do we do with enemy combatants in general? And this is still, 17 years, 18 years after 9/11, we're still dealing with this. The Europeans, of course, hate Gitmo, but at the same time, they don't have a real process for enemy combatants. They're trying to try them as criminals. So I think what we likely need here, and some senators have talked about this, is perhaps some sort of international regime to try these enemy combatants, because we can't take all of these people and put them in Gitmo, and no one clearly wants them in their country. So we're going to have to come up with another legal mechanism to deal with these fighters.
It's a big issue. Matthew.
We have room in Gitmo, and if she's not an American citizen, that's where she should go. If she's a citizen, we can indict her. That's what Andy McCarthy recommends, and I agree with him. So the choice is relatively simple. I feel like we're looking through the wrong end of the telescope here. Why are we feeling any sympathy for this woman when ISIS is a genocidal former regime, thank goodness, that murdered women, murdered children, devastated Christians and other religious minorities? So the choice is a simple one. Citizen, indict. Non-citizen, Gitmo.
Well, I think Secretary of State Pompeo was pretty clear. I mean, he's pretty cut and dry.
Well, I don't think he was clear enough, because I would like to hear from them their rationale for why she's not a citizen. So I've heard the birthright argument, but she got a passport, and there is some debate about whether he was a diplomat or because he ended his diplomatic service.
A month before.
Sure, but she got a passport. So then the other part of it is you join a foreign arm. They're not a state. It's a terrorist organization. She pretty clearly, in my estimation, committed treason, which is one of the ways you lose your citizenship. But then again, you'd have to go through a court process. So I just want to know, I just want to hear them clearly state their case for why she's not a citizen, why she can't come into the country. Because if she is a citizen, the law's the law. You have to go through the process.
What do we think happens if these foreign countries don't take these fighters back? What happens to these, 800 plus that are in northeastern Syria?
Yeah, this is why we have to come up with some sort of legal resolution with the Europeans. It makes no sense that we would take an American citizen like Anwar al-Awlaki and kill him via a drone strike, kill his son 2 weeks later via a drone strike during the Obama administration. So you can kill American citizens without due process in the middle of a war zone, but you don't have a legal mechanism for what to do with them. So, this is one of those instances in which the Europeans really like to push stuff under the rug. And as we get near the end of this war in Syria, we're going to have to deal with it.
Ted Cruz had a bill, the Expatriate Terrorist Act, that he submitted in a previous Congress that would strip them of citizenship as soon as they leave for enemy territory. He should resubmit that bill, and Congress should pass it and the president sign it.
Is there a sense inside the White House that the Syria part is coming to an end, that this president is going to get those troops back?
Well, Trump wants to. There's been a rearguard action from people like Lindsey Graham trying to get him to commit to some kind of skeletal U.S. presence there in a stabilization force or something in a buffer zone. There's also another zone where they're wanting to keep people more long-term. Trump wants them out. So I think it's going to happen. I don't think there's going to be a long-term substantial presence there under the Trump administration. But, there's a lot of wiggle room there and TBD.
And the request that maybe other European countries fill the void of U.S. troops coming out didn't seem like it was met with a lot of happiness over in Germany.
Yeah, I was there at the Munich Security Conference. I think that there was a lot of issues, namely Merkel giving her probably final speech and quite angry at the administration over a few things. But, saying that, from a political perspective, I'd love to know, what do the 2020 Democrat candidates think about this? What do they want to do with these fighters? Do they want to send them to Gitmo? This is the real world stuff that these guys need to start answering. And I think, we don't want this stuff to be political, but it is. And if the president is forcing 2020 Democrats to, defend these actions or defend what to do with these terrorists, it's just a winner for him every day.
Panel, thank you. When we come back, a little forecast to Vietnam.
Liberty Mutual customizes your car insurance.